Our story begins a couple of years ago when I made this full sheet sandpaper holder, and almost immediately I thought that I could make a sanding block that worked the same way. And recently I got into 3D printing, and that was one of the first things that I designed and made. The key feature of this sanding block is that it holds the paper on all four edges, and therefore it can't snag and tear. The 3D printed version is fairly simple, and I'm going to use that as the model to make one from wood. So I'm going to measure the pad first. That's where the sandpaper goes. I can see that it's 3 3/4 inches wide and 4 3/4 inches long. I've got a scrap of 1/2 inch Baltic birch plywood. That is the right width. I'm going to rip that and then cut it to length. Now I need to make a groove down the middle, so I'm just going to cut that out on the table saw, making a series of passes. I'm going to do a little sanding on the edge of this, and this is actually the first version of the sanding block that I modeled and printed. So the next part that I need to make is the retaining frame that goes around the pad and holds the sandpaper on. And I'm going to be making that from solid maple. I'm going to cut those into strips the right width and then cut them to rough length. And now I'm going to lower the blade so that I can cut a groove in 2 of those pieces. And that groove is to receive the handle that slides in after. Now the easiest way to determine the length of these parts is to put them in place and then measure them. I'm going to do it for the length, and I'm also going to do it for the width. And with those accurate measurements, I can cut them to the final length. Now the 2 pieces on the end need to be full height, and they have the grooves cut in them, but the 2 parts on the side need to be shorter, and I'm going to cut those now. Next step is to make it so this frame goes together and is strong. So I'm going to cut bridle joints to do that, and that involves cutting a groove into the ends of the short pieces and cutting a tongue on the ends on the longer pieces. And you can see how that goes together here. When that gets glued up with polyurethane construction adhesive, that'll be super strong and it'll be hard to break. With that glued up, I'm going to leave it to set overnight. And while that's drying, I got to tell you about the 3D printed version of the sanding block that I have here. Well, I sent that file to 3D OCD, and he made a much more refined version of the sanding block, and that's what you're looking at right here. If you're into 3D printing, you should check out his channel. There's a link in the description. He's also got a video up showing that sanding block being printed, and the best part is that he's giving the files away. Now, like I said, I'll let that glue dry overnight, and now I'm going to round over the corners and get rid of the glue squeeze out. And now you can see here's the printed one, and it has those holes in the corners, and those are clearance for the sandpaper. However, I don't know that that's strictly needed, so I'm not going to bother with the wooden one, although it would be easy enough to do with a round file, or it could be drilled out. Now the next part is the handle that slips into the grooves cut in the end pieces, and I need to accurately measure that, and once again I'm using a scrap of Baltic birch plywood. I'll cut it to size first, and then I'll cut the tongues on the ends. And you can see how nicely that fits in. Now I'm going to tilt the blade on my table saw to 45 degrees so that I can chamfer the edges on that block, mainly just for looks. Now looking at the 3D printed version again, you can see there's a little lever here that goes down into that slot that's cut in the pad, and that locks it in place and keeps it from coming out. So I need to cut a slot in the handle part for that lever to fit into. I'm using a finish nail for the axle, and I just need to drill the pilot hole to the right size. I cut the lever out bigger than it needs to be. I'm going to mark it and trim off the bottom. So with the finish nail put in as the axle, I'm just going to trim the ends off and then mark where it needs to sit down inside the block. I go over to my workbench and use my 3D printed tail vise to hold the stock while I cut those screws by hand with a chisel. Now to hold it in, I made a couple of filler blocks to go on top, and I'm using super glue to glue those in place, and then I can trim them off and sand them flush. And here you can see how it goes together, and that lever keeps it from sliding back out. Here I've got a quarter sheet of sandpaper. You put that down and you put the pad on top of it, and then you fold the edges up around the pad and then put it inside the retaining frame. Now back to that original design for this thing, and I'm talking about the handle now in particular. I redesigned the handle to be more ergonomic, as in it keeps your wrist straight rather than turned over to one side with that straight handle. So I'm going to do the same with the wooden version, and it starts with a hardwood block that's cut into an oval. And then I'm going to glue that down. And while that's drying, I'm going to mark out the shape for the grip and cut that out on the bandsaw. But first I need to change the blade to a smaller one so I can cut this all in one go. Now round over the edges and a little bit of sanding on there and glue it onto the piece that's already glued on. I gave that a couple hours to dry, and now I can sand it, and I'm going to drive in a couple of screws just to make sure it doesn't break off. And here you can see how it goes together and how it looks. That lever is a little bit hard to grip, so I'm going to file a slot into the edge. And then when that's done, I can bring it outdoors and spray on a couple of coats of clear finish, and it is done.